We're delighted, Michael, that you could be a part of our session and that you could lead us on this endeavor today. And glad that our participants are joining with us as well. So, Michael, I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you get started.
Okay, Pam, thank you. Hey, Laurie and Nancy, glad you were able to join us today. Sorry you're not on fall break this week. We are. So I'm out of school today, tomorrow, or excuse me, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. You probably wish you were like my grandson who's visiting with us. He's been out all last week and all this week too. So no such luck for me either. So anyway, let me just kind of take a couple of minutes and introduce the session to you this afternoon and what we'll be speaking about. So our session deals with teaching about the presidential election using Active Classroom and resources on Active Classroom. Just to introduce myself a little bit, my name is Michael Hutchison. I am a social studies teacher in Vincennes, Indiana at Lincoln High School. I'm in my 38th year in the classroom, and I'm a certified trainer for both Active Classroom and Stratologica as well. I've written several titles for Social Studies School Service, so if you've used especially the U.S. history material in Active Classroom, you've probably used some of my work before. I've also written things like several backward planning units for U.S. history and the Conquering Close Reading series for Active Classroom as well. I've also written for C-SPAN and PBS, including several Ken Burns films such as The Civil War, The War, Baseball, and The Roosevelts in Intimate History. And I was excited to have the opportunity to do this session when Pam offered it to me because probably like you, as a government and history teacher, the idea of teaching about, especially this presidential election with so many twists and turns in it, was very appealing to me. So I'm looking forward to having a little bit of time to discussing some things with you this afternoon. And certainly if you have any questions on anything that we're going to discuss today, if you please enter those questions in the chat window. Pam and I will be sort of fielding those, and either we can answer them at the end of our session today or sometime during the session if there's anything that you'd like to ask us about what I selected or whatever. You'll notice that when we look through some of the activity sets, for example, I'm going to start with the one for historical election campaigns. This is a rather big activity set. By the way, I should have mentioned earlier, and I didn't, that all of these activity sets have been shared with you. So all you need to do is go to the Shared Activity Set tab when you are looking for activities or looking for content for your classes. And the key word is Presidential Election 2016. So if you see that, you should be able to find all of the activity sets that I'm going to share with you today. So this is one about historical election campaigns, and I think this is important to bring up because one of the things that I think our students will be asking us will be, how does this election campaign compare or not compare to past elections? And of course, we might find that there were many controversies and issues that arose in prior election campaigns that may be not nearly as controversial as the ones we're seeing right now, but you know, still they made the election somewhat controversial in its own way or somewhat unsure of the outcome or whatever. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on 2 activities for each activity set that I'm going to show you today. And there's, in this one, for example, there's 770 minutes. Well, frankly, it'd be very difficult, if not impossible, for you or I to use all of these activities in a 50-minute class period like I have every day. However, hopefully you'll be able to find things that you'll be able to pick and choose and say, oh, I really want to use this, or I don't want to use this, but I find something else in here that I want to use. So the first example of an activity that I'd like to share with you today comes from a book that I wrote about 3 years ago called Conquering Close Reading. And this one deals with, it's a section called, or chapter called, Becoming Free. And I'm doing this in Active Classroom, so you'll notice that the one I want to focus on is reading number 4, A Disputed Election. So when I click on that, what I'm looking at is a small reading that comes from Joy Haken's book, Freedom: A History of Us, that deals with the election of 2000, which, you know, is again another very controversial and very interesting election from the angle of the fact that it was a deadlocked election in the Electoral College. For several weeks after the election, we did not know who the presidential winner was going to be, whether it was going to be Al Gore or George W. Bush. So what the students do is they look at the reading, which is very small in this instance. It's only, what, maybe about 125 words or so. And then what they do is they read with a pencil. I don't have the annotation tool set up on my version of this right now, but as you may know, you can create a lesson where students can annotate various things in the lesson. They can highlight different colors and that sort of thing. So what we want them to do, first of all, is do close reading. And close reading is a meaningful and comprehensive reading of a small passage or whatever. And this would be particularly good for middle school level, maybe for high interest but low ability, and it would even be good for high school level. So the first thing they have to do is they have to highlight the key ideas, and they annotate the main points main points about what they see in the reading. So they're going to paste the main point right here. So it depends on what they see as the main point of the reading. Then below it there are two questions. One deals with irony. So we're looking at here a specific instance of something that might be intentionally contrary to what was expected. So you know, we don't have a whole lot of time to look at this in terms of what the irony is, but just curious, it's like, for example, the ballots were misleading, voting machines failed, and that sort of thing. And at the end of it, it wasn't really the voters that made a determination about who won the election. Instead, it was the U.S. Supreme Court by a 5-4 majority. So you may want to, if you're using this lesson, you may want to also, and it's mentioned in the answer key, perhaps do a quick just debate with your students about, well, you know, what's the irony here, because it's not the voters that made the decision of who won Florida, it's actually the United States Supreme Court. While you're thinking of that, one thing I should have mentioned a minute ago, and I frankly forgot, is would you take a few minutes just at this point in time, since I know you know how to use the chat feature of the GoToMeeting, but how about let's just take a couple minutes and everyone just type in your geographic area where you're located, and also where you are as far as you know, what subject you teach and that sort of thing. Then at the end of this lesson, what students can do is they can submit this information for review for you, and in the grading interface you can see what the recommended answers are, what the students you know, answers are, and you can grade that, you know, adjust it depending on what you see as the main focus of what you want the students to know about this. Okay, I see Nancy is located in Leander, Texas. I've been to Texas a couple of times, been to Dallas, been to San Antonio a couple of times, so I don't know if I'm near any place that you're located or not, but Texas is a neat state. So Nancy also teaches functional life skills, middle school grades 6, 7, and 8. I do not teach middle school. I'm licensed, but I've never taught it. Never been to Austin, but I'm sure Austin is a neat city to be in. A place that I've always wanted to visit and never have is Houston. I've been to Dallas and really like Dallas, and really like San Antonio as well. So let's move on from this. And the other activity I've selected from historically significant elections is this one right here, the election of 1960. And this comes from the decision-making series, and as you'll notice here, I have several different activities from the decision-making series. Why did I pick 1960? Because it's probably one of the first elections that I can frankly remember personally. And it's also an election featuring John F. Kennedy, who's kind of a personal favorite of mine. So, they don't have, I don't think they had 1964, so that would be an LBJ. So you Texas folks may be able to find something that you like from there. So when I look at the election in 1960, I would use this as a lesson opener, because one of the things that this question asks students to do is it asks them to predict who will win this election. Well, for us, depending on our age, I suppose, it's pretty obvious that it's going to be John F. Kennedy winning a slim majority against Richard Nixon in the election in 1960. But for our students, depending on their ages and how much they know about history otherwise, this may be a little more difficult for them to understand exactly, well, who won this election and who these candidates really are. So if I scroll down a little bit, one of the things I like is they talk about candidate A, and pretty soon I'm able to determine, based on my knowledge, that it's Richard Nixon, because he's the current Vice President of the United States. And of course I know that John F. Kennedy never served as Vice President. So it gives me a little bit of background about who they were and what their positions on the issues were. So if I were going to introduce this as a watershed election, which frankly it is, particularly because it's television that made a big impact in this election, I might use this, as I said, as a lesson opener. So I can look, compare, and contrast the differences between candidate A, which is Richard Nixon, and of course candidate B, which is John F. Kennedy. So at the end, the question essentially is, who do I predict will win the election? So as a teacher, we might have some additional sources, some additional things that we might use to help the student make the decision in this election. And when I go back to this in the original activity set, you'll notice that I've linked to other activities, videos, and so forth that give us a little bit of knowledge about who John F. Kennedy was and who Richard Nixon was. And of course, at the end of it, I can just tell the students, who won the election, and we can kind of compare and contrast that with the actual vote and the actual outcome, and who the eventual winner actually was. So what I am going to tell you is there's a number of different things here that you can use. Some that I did not include in the activity set. For example, there are several backward planning units that they aren't really activities, but they're more a backbone for a U.S. history curriculum or a government curriculum that you might use. And definitely the recent U.S. history one talks about the election of 2000 and the Bush-Gore controversy. So you may want to use that with what you're doing, as far as your lessons and what you think are appropriate. So I'll back out of here, and again, one more time, you can see there's several different activities here. So, for example, here's a video lesson about the Nixon-Kennedy debates that might be usable. There's a couple here about the election of 2000. If you wanted to get back a little bit farther than that, we have some for the election of 1936, even back into the 19th century. So depends on what your state standards might be, or it depends on what your personal interest would be. And certainly, you're more than welcome to pick and choose what you want. I just picked a couple of representative lessons that might be helpful. So let's move on from talking about historic elections. Let's move to another major topic, which is the right to vote. So when I look at this one, there's a couple of activities that I want to focus on in just a moment. But at the same time, of course, the right to vote and definitely the role of women in this campaign seems to have taken on new meaning in just the last few days or so. And definitely, this is going to be an interesting election. I teach seniors in high school, so I really don't feel as shy, I guess is the best way to put it, to talk about some of the recent things that have come out about Bill Clinton or Donald Trump or whatever in their relationships with women. And I don't think it would be appropriate for us to probably discuss that at this point in time, since that's not the focus of what our session together is. At the same time, though, our students are probably going to have questions about the role of women in politics, or the role of other people in politics as well, or even for that matter, their role as far as potential voters. So, basically what Nancy told me a few minutes ago, she's not going to have students that are eligible to vote in this election, but certainly she's going to have prospective voters. And along with that, she may also have students that she hears their parents talk, or they hear their parents talk about different issues and that sort of thing. So that's definitely something that those kids are going to want to discuss with their parents, or their guardians, or significant other people in their families, or whatever. So the first one in the right to vote that I selected is one from the Debating the Document series. And this is a good series for any number of levels. So, for example, I use this a lot with my dual credit United States history students, but you could adapt it easily for regular U.S. history, or even for middle school, Nancy. So hopefully this would be something that you might find useful as well. What I like about debating the documents, and as you can tell, it's somewhat pretty involved here, but for example, we start out with like things like what are primary sources, about how to do the actual activity here, and as you can tell, it's somewhat involved. So what I like is there's an introductory essay that talks about women's suffrage, how women got the right to vote. From there, there's a timeline that helps students understand what happened in the relationship to American government or American history. So one thing I might ask, which is a pretty simple question, which is what presidential election did students actually women actually have the right to vote for the first time? And of course, that would be the election of 1920. So there's a number of things here you could do, but what I think is really cool about debating the documents is there's a number of primary sources that are either visual, or they are also text in nature. So I love this one, for example, because what I can do is I can use a magnifying tool, and I can see what these women in the picture are doing. I can also get an idea of maybe different aspects of what I see here. So so what the kids have to do with this is they have to look at this, and they have to do some they have to make some conclusions about what do they see in the photo, and what exactly is the message of this. So I can see, for example, the women are kind of lounging around, looking at looking at newspapers, looking at cards of some kind, while the husband and the children are outside looking in. And it looks like the typical roles of the family are somewhat changed to some extent from that period. We always think of the woman being the person who runs the household and takes care of the kids, and in this instance, it's entirely different. So it's kind of interesting to see that. I can also enlarge the entire picture, or I can use the quad tool, and I can look at different segments of this picture and look at different quarters of it, so to speak. So it looks like the women are engaged in very, very, very interesting conversations about politics and the election, while the man is out there doing women's roles. And I think the idea, Nancy said, that visual is an awesome thing, is important. I think that's very valid. I also, there are other pictures that we could look at, other photos. So I like this one quite a bit as well. So in this one, I see the poor woman. She's working, carrying buckets of water. She must be a maid of some kind. But look at the ladder. She's looking at the ladder as she goes up the ladder. And up here at the top, I'm using the enlargement tool, the magnifying tool, women's suffrage. But look up at the very, very top, which is hard to read, if not impossible, by just looking at the cartoon. But look up at the very top up here. It's hard to read, but the word presidency. So I could easily see you using this with your students and saying, well, would the person who wrote this or drew this cartoon, would they have ever imagined in their wildest dreams that less than a century or a little bit more than a century later, that there would be a woman running as a major candidate, major party candidate for president, and possibly winning the presidency? In those days, they probably would never have considered that at all. So what my students might do, they would look at the different resources. The other thing that they would do, which is really cool here, is they would compare and contrast the sources. Which sources are more important to a historian? And that's where the debate comes in, that they might actually look at those sources, debate source A is better than source B, or source 1 is better than source 2, or whatever. And I generally have them do that in the classroom kind of debate. And so sometimes that gets a little bit spirited. And then they write short little, one-sentence answers, or maybe a short little 2 or 3 sentence essay to those questions. But the best part of it, at least for my students, is the document-based question at the end. And the one for this activity is women won the votes because by the early 1900s, their independent roles in public life made it clear that they were already active as citizens and deserved the vote. Do you agree or disagree with this statement, and why? So what the student has to do is they have to use the evidence that they've seen and write an essay based on what they see in the different resources, the different documents that they've seen. And also, I suppose, too, I always have them do a little bit with their own knowledge, what they've looked at, what they know already, but what they've studied in other parts of what we've done as far as, whether it's another resource or a textbook or, whatever it is. So I love debating the documents. Now, if you are not teaching a class or students that you feel would be able to do all of this, well, what you could do is, for example, you could do the maybe the debating and looking at the documents and not do the essay, or ask students to maybe write a short essay, or whatever works best for you. So I wouldn't rule these out if you have students that are more, like I said, high interest but low ability, or lower grade level. But you just would want to adapt this for the grade level that you know your students are in. So, like I said, I teach juniors and seniors in high school, so I'm more confident that they can do this kind of work maybe than I would if I were teaching, say, 6th grade. But not that they couldn't do it, it's just I would want to adapt it and make sure that I knew from their grade level. So the other example of an assignment or an activity I wanted to show you is this one right here, being a responsible voter. And you'll notice this comes from the series called Power Basics. So what this tells me right off the bat is that this is going to be somewhat more a basic level, low, like I said before, high interest, low ability activity. And so there's some things here that that I can show you directly online. There are going to be some things that you may have to download as the teacher as far as PDF files. But I think this is really good for a basic framework foundation for what does it take to be a responsible voter. One thing you'll notice, and I should have mentioned this with the other activities, there is always a teacher guide that comes with this, with generally everything available in a PDF format. So, for example, if I don't have a class where I have one-to-one teacher, or excuse me, student computer access, I can always print these out and assign them as homework. Or I can print out certain things, I can print out answer keys, I can do all sorts of things. So don't feel constrained that this can only be done online, because the great majority of activities can be done online or they can be done offline. For example, in my own situation, as in regard to debating the documents, I usually have the students submit the essay to me in paper form because I love to mark them up. And so I usually mark up a lot of things on them, which I can't do as easily in the active classroom grading interface. And you'll notice Pam said, about simulations. I do have some simulations included in some of the activity sets. I would definitely consider acting those, being involved with some of those as well. So what we're looking at here with this activity is, I guess the goal is kind of like what you and I would think about as far as just an objective for our lessons: to understand the need for voters to stay informed, evaluate facts and opinions, and vote regularly. Now, how do we do that? Well, we can look at some of the different issues that occur as far as voting, why people do vote, why people don't vote, what a responsible voter is. So what the students can do is they can check on these, the ones that they think are appropriate. For example, I would say I'm not picking on the ones hopefully that I would actually select. I vote for the person who's the best dresser. Well, I'm not sure who I would vote for in that instance, because I don't know if Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton dress particularly well. I never vote for anybody over 50 years old. Well, in this election, I'm not going to be voting for anybody. How could I start learning more about the issues in my community, state, or country? What is a realistic goal for myself? Well, obviously there are going to be some things here that are really important. Like, for example, I could read the local newspaper. I could listen to the radio from my local radio stations and television stations. Nancy, I'm really glad that you enjoyed this one. I think this would be really a good one for your students. So, they just interact with you as far as different things about what makes it, important to vote. So I like some of these about voter registration. I mentioned to Pam, I live in one of the most restricted states in the union as far as voter registration and actual voting. In Indiana, you're required to have a photo ID in order to be able to vote. And of course, there are some people who don't drive a car, so they don't have a photo ID and they don't want to take the time to go get one. So, I mean, that could be something. I don't know what Texas's law is like, but that might be something to bring up with your students, even though they are younger kids and they're not going to be voting in this election. Certainly they may have, maybe talk to their parents or grandparents about how difficult it is for them to do that because of the fact that, they can't get a photo ID. So things about why citizens don't vote. There's some open-ended questions with that. Voting in the last election, so they have the opportunity here that they can interview maybe their parents or grandparents about why did they vote. For most of them, it's probably going to be either a municipal election in 2015 or maybe the presidential election back in 2012. And at the end of it all, they are supposed to come up with a solution to kind of remedy the problem why people don't vote. And at the end of it, there's a quiz. So I would probably be less likely to use Power Basics because my students are generally more upper level, but I could easily see using this if I were teaching middle school, Nancy, like you do, or students that are maybe high interest but low ability, and there's a number of different ways to go about this. Certainly this would be good for elementary. So let's move on from talking about the right to vote and the issues as far as right to vote. And let's talk a little bit next about political parties, which again is another issue that is a major one in this election. It always is. About what role do political parties play in elections, and in this election in particular. It seems almost like at least one candidate is at war with his own political party. So let's look at some things that I had selected for this one. By far, this is the biggest activity set that I created. And this one is over 1,500 minutes long. Again, there's no possible way that I could possibly use all this in one election cycle, let alone in 1 month or 1 week before, the presidential election. So I would recommend that you pick and choose, or if by chance you want to do this, even after the election is over. Certainly politics is going to be a major thing as we find out who the new president is going to be, and we know who he or she will have to do as far as dealing with their own party and the opposition party, whichever party that is. One more time, I want to remind you two things. First of all, I want to remind you that if you have questions about anything that I'm showing you today, then please don't don't be afraid to pack that into the chat window, and Pam and I will field those as we go along. In addition to that, remember that you can find all of these activity sets. They are in the Shared Activity Sets tab in Active Classroom. The keyword is Presidential Election 2016. So let's look at just a couple of activities for political parties. The first one I selected is Document-Based Activities in U.S. History, Growth of Political Parties. And as soon as I saw this one, I'm going to tattle on myself a little bit here. I was a little bit disappointed in myself because I thought this would have been a great one for me to use with my dual credit kids, and I totally spaced on it. I didn't see it. So I could have used this one for an upper level class, but I could have used it for a regular U.S. history class as well. Notice, as always, there's a teacher's guide available. So when I look at the introduction, what this is essentially a DBQ, document-based question. So the students are going to look at different historical pieces of evidence, primary sources, if you will, and then they're going to use that information to answer a document-based question. What led to the rise of the political parties in the 1790s? So what I do here, and I'm doing this for the sake of expediency, there's a excerpt here from Jefferson about Hamilton, very short. Hamilton was not only a monarchist, but in support of a monarchy based on corruption. So what we ask the students to do is type in their answer here. What did Jefferson think of Hamilton? Well, I can imagine that they're probably going to say Jefferson did not think very highly of Alexander Hamilton, even though he does have a musical named after him. Now, in response to that, here's a short excerpt from a writing from Hamilton about Madison and Jefferson. So they get the idea that the feeling is mutual here. Then there's another document from Jefferson. So again, as you can tell, these are very, very short. They're not overly broad in length. So the students should be able to read these very quickly and come up with answers very, very fast. So this comes from Washington's farewell address. Here's one from Jefferson to John Wise. Here's one from John Allen, who was a Federalist congressman in support of the Sedition Act. Here's one from George Hay, who was a supporter of Jefferson. So, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to look at both sides of the issue. So what happens is at the end of it again, they come to the document-based question. What led to the rise of political parties in the 1790s? So they write their essay out, and again, going to the grading interface, you see what the student wrote, and the other thing that you do is you also get an opportunity to look at what the suggested answer is, and then you can make a conclusion based on how effectively were they in answering the question. The other one that I really like from this is a newer activity that hasn't been available very long, from Cases and Controversies in U.S. History. And it could fit in a number of different activity sets that I created. For example, it could fit in the historical election one, but this one deals with Watergate. So what we've got to do here, what the students have to do, is they have to look at an excerpt from a primary source about Watergate. And this is an address from President Richard Nixon in April of 1973. This one is a little bit longer. As you can tell, it's several paragraphs, but it's maybe one or two sentences in each paragraph. So it's not overly broad and overly long. And depending on our ages, I also like the fact that there's a glossary that has nothing to do with age, but depending on our ages, some of us know more about Watergate just because we lived through it than maybe what some of you other folks do if you've read about it and studied it in history or whatever. So in 1973, this was right before my high school graduation, so I remember this time extremely well. And the first question, I really like it because it kind of points right to my frame of reference as a person who was alive, and at that point even interested in history and government, because I knew pretty much that was going to be my career. So it says, hindsight, being able to see after the event what should have been done can make very many historical events seem obvious. Our knowledge of Nixon's involvement in the Watergate scandal lets us see through this speech. But if, like much of the American public, you had not known of Nixon's guilt, how would you have reacted to this speech? Try to look at this speech with as few preconceptions as possible and describe how it would have made you think about the president. Well, probably a lot of people would say, well, the man had just gone to China. He had just ended the Vietnam War, and certainly he would be somebody who would be a person that maybe we could trust because of all the great foreign policy decisions he had made and accomplishments he had done. So maybe we would have been somewhat forgiving. And again, this is what students have to do. They have to be able to cut through what the times would have dictated that people would have thought compared to what actually did happen. So in the second question, I like the idea about manipulation and all that. And then the third thing is it's a little bit of a rewrite. In other words, maybe a creative thing. So this is another good activity that students can use as far as like looking at historical events through a different lens, so to speak. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about historical elections. We've talked a little bit about the right to vote, and we've just finished talking about political parties. Another thing that has been a very, very, very significant issue in other elections is the Electoral College. So pardon me when I hit the wrong button, but let me look at the role of the Electoral College. Again, as you'll notice, this is substantially a bigger activity set than we could ever hope to use in a single semester, or let alone in a single week or two. But there are some things here that I wanted to highlight. One is the Framework for Democracy series. And in that series, as you can tell, it's very easy, very short. There is a small video segment. Usually these videos are about 5 minutes long, give or take a little bit. And they usually have a very small 2-question activity. So in this one, the activity is, what's the main idea of the video? So they would type in that answer. Then what are 3 details that support this idea? They would type in that answer. Now, why would I use these activities? Well, I don't know what it's like in your school district, but in mine, our principal is big into bell-to-bell teaching. He wants us to start from the minute the tardy bell rings and go until the bell rings for dismissal for that period. But as you probably know, and Nancy, I'm sure probably you would agree with me, there are different things that we have to do in the classroom. Like, for example, we have to take attendance. We may have other duties dealing with our our students that need dealing with immediately, whether it's passing out materials or whatever. So this would be a great bell ringer activity. We could just say at the start of class, okay, class, well, I take attendance, watch the video, and answer the questions. And, we can assign these in advance in Active Classroom. The students can easily access it in Active Classroom. They can answer the questions and submit it. So this might be an activity that might take, about maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes to do. And it should be relatively simple. So, and of course you could always make it where if a student wanted to, they could view the video maybe 2 times if needed or whatever. The other activity I wanted to spend some time with you today is a little bit more complex. And this is from the Colonial Williamsburg series. And I like this one because it generally, or for all intents and purposes, gives you a little bit of an idea about the framework of the Electoral College as far as in the ratification and the writing of the Constitution. So this is a number of different things. So one of the things I like, and Nancy, this might be helpful for you, is there is a glossary of terms. There's about 15 or 20 terms here that are related to the writing of the Constitution. There's also a timeline that you can use to kind of put things in perspective about what happened during the Constitutional Convention and that sort of thing. And then there are 3 video activities. So these are done, again, by Colonial Williamsburg, and I have never been to Williamsburg. I've been by it. But you get an idea there about what exactly, again, what are the controversies or the issues that have to be decided. And then, again, the second video talks about agreement or disagreement with the Constitution. And the third one talks about ratification. And then there are a couple of really cool activities. I would probably do these in reverse because I do the Articles of Confederation first, and then I do the construction of the Constitution. So there's a number of typed or pages that in the teacher's guide that will help you with that to some extent as well. So the last area that I want to speak to you about this afternoon, as if we've talked about political parties, and we've talked about the right to vote, and we've talked about the Electoral College, and we talked about significant historical elections, is let's end up by talking a little bit about media and politics. And I mentioned to Pam when we talked about this yesterday, it was kind of ironic that one of the candidates in the speech that they gave day before yesterday about every other word was boo CNN because they felt that they had been mistreated by CNN Network and what they call the mainstream media. So, I guess, one of the things that we would have to do as teachers is we'd have to say, well, there is some bias out there. There are some things that, you and I as voters that are intelligent, we're going to have to look at and say, well, is this really true? Does this really reflect what the candidate stands for? So that's why I really like this one from the Government Activator series. And I did not include all of these, but there's also a really good government activator on politics and elections that you might be interested in looking at. And again, all the government activators have a historical background essay. They also have activities, and then they kind of end with a simulation kind of thing, which I think are definitely things that you want to think about or including with your students. And Nancy, I could easily see you using these on the middle school level. So again, there's a really good teacher's guide you can download and print out anything that I'm going to show you today or talk about or use. I like the idea of the word bank, and as we go through the historical background essay, you'll see some of the word bank terms are actually highlighted in, I guess, what is that, a tan or brown or beige color. So as we go through it, you can see some things about progressivism, Roosevelt's fireside chats, broadcast news, the Fourth Estate, bias, decentralized, and certainly, that's an interesting term because, when I talked about the election of 1960, you only had 3 networks. Well, now you've got all sorts of networks, cable and so forth. So they read through the background essay, and then there are some questions that they're going to answer at the end of that. So they're going to look at, different things. They can find the answers to these easily in the background essay. Then they go into bias about the media, about different kinds of bias. Again, I don't know with a life skills class if this might be something, Nancy, that you could utilize with middle school, but certainly, you're welcome to look through that and maybe come up with some conclusions on your own. And then what they have to do is they have to look at media sources and they have to analyze the news media for that bias. So again, this is an activity that might take a day or two depending on the level of your students and how deep you want to get into it. The last resource that I want to show you this afternoon is this one here from a series called Everyday Life. And one of the reasons why I liked it is because television plays such an important role in our lives anymore. But there were certain pictures in here that I thought were hilarious. For example, I think about, I go back to the Kennedy-Nixon debates, and here's a picture of Kennedy and Nixon in their first debate. And obviously you can tell some of the things that we might talk about, how Kennedy looked contrasted against the background of the TV studio compared to Nixon. You can see Nixon dabbing up his upper lip here because of the heat from the lights. I know I can remember, I don't want to date Pam here, but I mean I can certainly remember, maybe Pam can too, how television sets looked in the 1950s and 1960s. And I can remember a time when television was about done for the day, about 10 o'clock at night, and that was about all you had. I'm not sure what this little boy is watching down here in this corner. Maybe Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. I can certainly remember that. And then they read through the reading, and then there's some different activities. Like, for example, Pam says she declines to answer, so I won't make her go into any more detail than that, but I think I'm a little older than Pam, so we'll just leave it at that. So anyway, she's answered, but a survey about television, they interview their classmates, what do they like to watch? My grandsons would probably like watching shows about zombies. Then there's a math activity which you have to download in PDF. I'll do that very quickly for you. And so this is what the activity looks like with this one. They have to find out the mean, the median, and the mode. And it's been a long time since I took statistics, so I'm not even going to go there. So Nancy, I hope you're better than I am as far as those things. And then as we go through it, some things about complete statements started for you. So they have to come up with some creative answers. So I like this one. Last night, the only television we had in the house went out for a moment. We panicked. What would we do? Finally, we went to Walmart and bought a brand new TV. That's probably what I'd do. So the kids do that. And then the benefit, the cornerstone, so like with that, they are required to come up with the 5 greatest TV programs that best describe life in America today. And what do they see as far as what programs would they select for a cornerstone, for something that people might look at 100 years from now or 200 years from now or whatever. So this is, again, probably something that might be a little bit more middle school based, but you could use it in a high school classroom as well. And Nancy, I can see your students probably using this easily. So those are all the examples of activities that I had for you this afternoon. And we have a few minutes left. I went a couple minutes over on time, but if Nancy, if you or Lori have any questions or anything you'd like to ask about, or any of the resources, how I selected them or anything, feel free to type that into the chat window now, and Pam and I will field those as we have a few minutes left, unless Pam, you think we've done enough with them for one day.